Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to our online lectures. So far, we've been discussing issues relating to phonetics. Today, we are going to move on to a phonology aspect of the course. So, on the course outline, the topic is contrastive versus non-contrastive unit. And when we say contrastive unit, what do we mean? Later, we also attempt to know what we mean by non-contrastive unit. But before we come to discuss in detail what contrastive or non-contrastive units are, I know some of the classes you just talked about phonetics, you didn't introduce phonology at all. So quickly, we are going to go through a little bit of what phonology is, and we will also do a very brief contrast between phonetics and phonology. So first, what is phonology? There are different definitions of phonology, and one of them is that phonology can be defined as the study of how speech sounds are organized and used in natural languages. So, how speech sounds can be organized and used in natural languages. So far, in the phonetic aspect of this course, we have been able to describe each speech sound. And when I say each speech sound, I'm talking about vowels and consonants. First, we describe them by using 4 parameters or 3 parameters for consonants. And later, for vowels, we use 4 parameters. And last week, we realized these descriptions or parameters can be reduced to properties we called features. So henceforth, we are going to use features in describing speech sounds when we discuss distinctive features in our last session. So back to phonology. We are saying phonology deals with the systems and patterns of sounds that occur in a language. Now, there are 2 different types of phonology, or when one decides to do phonology, the person may do 2 things. The first one is what we call segmental phonology. And in segmental phonology, the person will be studying the segments or speech sound system of a language, as we've done so far. Alternatively, another person will also be doing suprasegmental phonology, or in some contexts we call it prosodic phonology. And that person will be dealing with the study of properties above the segments or sounds of a language. I hope you remember 2 weeks ago we discussed suprasegmentals, so we know what supra means. Now, quickly, what is the difference between phonetics and phonology? We are going to contrast it in 2 major ways. The first one is, whilst phonetics studies the actual physical speech sounds or realization of speech sounds, phonology deals with the abstract sounds in our mental grammar. So as we move on later, we will expatiate this for you to understand it better. Again, while phonetics is across linguistic or is studied across all languages, phonology is language specific or language particular. So what we mean is, we don't say we are going to study phonetics of so and so, but phonetics, the sounds we have studied so far, applies to all sounds of all languages. So that is the difference. But phonology, every language has its rule that governs its sound structure and how the sounds can be combined. And other rules, when the sounds combine, the rules that apply, that one is language specific or language particular. Each and every language has its own rules pertaining to how speech sounds pattern in that particular language. So I've given an example. So we can say we are going to study the phonology of English or phonology of Nchumburu, but not a phonetics of Kusa. So at this point, Mr. Podo is right behind me, besides me here, if he has something to add before we move on.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think you are on point. The things you are saying don't need any further explanation, except that to add to the difference between phonetics and phonology, the reasons why phonology is language specific is the fact that even the number of sounds that are in individual languages are not the same. So if you take vowels, for example, and we want to compare tree and ebe, tree has about 10 vowels, while ebe has 7 vowels. So if you consider just these two numbers, that should tell you automatically that there are some vowels in tree that are not there in ebe. So when you are talking about phonology of ebe, you are talking about especially in the area of vowels, you are talking about only 7 vowels and how those vowels pattern with other consonants that they have in the language. And when you are talking about phonology of tree, you are talking about as many as 10 vowels with a difference of 3 vowels, and how those 10 vowels pattern with the other consonants in there. This variation is also there in terms of the consonants too. The consonant that begin my surname, Bodo, B, is not in tree. So tree speakers don't use B in their phonology. So phonology of Ebe has to be different from phonology of tree and any other language. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Podo, for the further explanations and additions. So we move on and say each human or natural language has its own set of distinctive speech sounds. Mr. Podo just gave us a gist of that. So these sets of distinctive sounds are what we call phonemes. So he gave examples of the number of vowels that are present in tree versus those vowels present in ebe. Similarly, consonants that are present in ebe and those that are present in tree. So each of these sounds constitute a phoneme, or when they are distinctive, they constitute a phoneme. Don't worry, shortly we are going to move on to what a phoneme is. Now, our question is, what is a phoneme? A phoneme is a contrastive sound, and sound here we mean speech sound of a language that distinguishes meaning. So in other words, it is a contrastive phonological unit of a language. And what do we mean by that? Every speech sound which when we change can cause or bring about a change in the meaning of a word, that sound constitutes a phoneme of that particular language. Let's note, a sound that may be phonemic or a phoneme in language A may not be a phoneme in language B. So that means what are a set of phonemes in a language might be different from what constitutes a phonemic inventory of another language. So therefore, the number of different sounds, either vowels or consonants or both vowels and consonants, that a language has which distinguish meaning constitutes the phonemic inventory of that particular language. So now let me pause at this point and ask, how many phonemes or vowels that are phonemes are there in your language? How many consonants in your language are phonemic? And by this we are saying when you change that consonant or vowel in a word, you change the meaning of that particular word. And let's note, phonemes are abstract. We realize these phonemes or sounds that are phonemic in our mind. And what do we mean by that? Again, we are going to know as we move on what we mean by that. And before even we describe with examples, what it means simply is phonemes are sounds we realize on our mind. So for instance, Just as an example, the word Peter, we know there's a sound po, consonant po in our mind, consonant t in our mind, and consonant in our mind. The same way, pie, there is a consonant po there in our mind. But sometimes when we actually speak, these consonants or sounds on our mind are realized in slightly different ways than what we have on our mind. So we'll move on and we'll come to give you specific examples of what we mean, sounds on our mind or in our mind, and sounds that are really or physically produced. So we represent sounds that are phoneme by two slashes or slanted lines, as you can see in the slide. So now back to our topic, contrastive units. What do we mean by contrastive units? So all that we are saying is all the phonemes that a language has constitute the contrastive unit of that particular language. That is, when they are changed, the sounds which when they are changed, they bring about a change in meaning of a word. Those sounds, we call them contrastive units of a particular language. I think Mr. Podo wants to add something to this.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's just when we replace one sound with another sound, and by replacing one sound with another sound, we get a different meaning. Then the sound that is replacing the other, the two of them are contrastive. It means they bring change in the meaning of the word from which in which we are making the replacement. So if you take, for example, a, and you put it between p and t, you would have pat. And then if you replace the a with o, you will have pot. It means by changing the a, removing the a and putting o there, that is why the meaning of pat has changed to pot. It therefore means that even though o does not have any meaning of its own, it is actually the cause of the change in the meaning of pat to pot. When it is introduced, it goes in to replace the a.
Thank you very much once again, Mr. Podo, for the elaborations given. Now, similarly, when a consonant pad, d, in the word pad, is changed to t into pat, pad versus pat. The final consonant, one is voiced, the other one is voiceless. In each case, the meaning changes. And where is the change in meaning? Is the last consonant of the two words. So we'll come to that later. We'll give it another name, maybe minima, pair, minima set. We'll come to that shortly. Now, so far we've discussed what a phoneme is, and realized a phoneme is a sound, speech sound, which when we change, we bring a change in the meaning of a word. It is not every sound that when we change can bring a change in meaning of a word. Sometimes some sounds, when we change them in a word, they don't actually bring a change in meaning of a word. So we are saying all phonemes, since they can bring about a change in meaning of a word, are called contrastive units. So phonemes are contrastive units. Again, we are saying phonemes are realized on the minds of the speakers. Are there sounds that can be realized by speaking it, or what we termed as the physical actual realizations? And the answer is yes. And what do we call those sounds? This brings us to a term in phonology called a phone. So what is a phone? A phone can be defined as the actual physical realization of a phoneme. The actual physical realization of a phoneme. And unlike the phoneme, phones are represented by a curly bracket or what we call square bracket. So please let's pay attention to how we represent phonemes and how we represent phones. Phonemes, we realize, are represented by slanted lines or slashes, whilst phones are represented by curly brackets or what we call square brackets. For example, on the mind of a speaker of English, there is only one sound, that is t, in the following words. The first word is the word tie. The second word is the word stop. The third word is what. What. So tie, t. Stop, t as the second consonant, and what, the last consonant of the word. So on our mind, there is one and same sound there. But in reality, when we speak or pronounce these words, this consonant t can be realized in 3 different ways by English speakers. So now let's look at how they can be realized. So for instance, the first word tie, an English speaker will pronounce the first T with much more energy than it will be in the second word stop. And you remember when we were talking about voice onset timing, we said the consonant T in this context will be aspirated. So the T we have on our mind, now it is actually realized with aspiration. So that's why it is aspirated in tie. But in the word stop, T there is what we call a plain consonant. It is not aspirated. It is realized as it is in the mind. But in the third example, in a British English, instead of the Ghanaian pronunciation what, you realize it with a glottal stop in what. What. So the T we have in our mind is realized with a glottal stop. So one sound, phone, T, can be realized in 3 different phones. First one is aspirated T, second one is a plain stop T, and the third one is the glottal stop. So this brings us to another terminology called allophone. Now, what is an allophone? An allophone is a set of phones that belongs to one phoneme. A set of phones that are derived or come from one phoneme is called allophones. So from our previous example, the phoneme T can be realized in 3 different ways. And the allophones are the plain T, the aspirated T, and the glottal stop. So these are the allophones of the phoneme T. Yeah. Mr. Podo wants to add something to me.
Yes, something very small. You told us, Mr. Adumako told us earlier on that phonemes are placed between 2 slanted lines, or what we call slashes. But then on the screen right now, the ones you are calling phones, they are in a different thing. Can you tell us why?
Thank you. So as I said earlier on, those in curly bracket or square brackets are the actual physical realizations of the phoneme. So that is why they are in curly or square brackets.
Thank you.
Yes. So we move on now. So these are the concept phoneme, phones, and allophones. Now, we started talking about what we call contrastive units, and we said phonemes are contrastive unit. Now, we have moved on to talk about phones. So now, what are non-contrastive units? So all the allophones that we've seen in the two slides previously are non-contrastive units. And why are we saying these allophones? I mean, t, plain t, aspirated t, and glottal stop are non-contrastive. And this simply means when we change either of these sounds, they don't cause changes in meaning of the words in which they occur. So for example, instead of the native speaker's pronunciation of walk, we all know in Ghanaian pronunciation the final consonant is realized as t in what. So instead of pronouncing what, we pronounce it what. The meaning doesn't change. The only thing that changes is the pronunciation, which will not meet what the native speaker would expect to hear. So that is what we mean by a sound being non-contrastive. When we change in a word, it doesn't bring a change in meaning of that particular word. We say that sound is non-contrastive. So all allophones or phones or physical realizations of a phoneme are non-contrastive. I hope you are all following up to this point. So this brings us to the end of the discussions on contrastive and non-contrastive units. But aside from that, there's also a discussion on the term called free variation. Now, having known what a contrastive unit is and what non-contrastive unit is, what do we mean by free variation? When two words differ only in one sound occurring at the same place, but their difference doesn't bring about a distinction in meaning, we say those two sounds are in free variation. Now, this sounds a little bit confusing. When we were talking about phonemes, we say two sounds, when we change, occurring in the same place, when we change them in a word, they bring about a change in meaning. Now, we are still saying phonemes, when they occur at the same place, we change them, but they don't bring about a change in meaning of the word, are called free variation. We will give you examples to facilitate your understanding. So, for instance, but before we give the examples, let's note English doesn't have free variation or words in free variation. But fewer examples of languages have free variation. So one of the most important examples of languages that have free variation is Akan. So in Akan, in the word for child can be akwada. Let's note the last consonant, d, or akwara, or akwala, So there are three consonants there, d, and they are in free variation in this example. Does it mean d, and are not phonemes in Akan? The answer is not. Is no. Each is a phoneme on its own. That means each, when changed in other words, can bring about a change in meaning, but not in this example we have given you. So for instance, the word for tree is dia. I don't think there is any Akan word called ria that exists for the same word tree. So sounds in free variation are not necessarily non-contrastive. They can be contrastive in other contexts or in other examples. Environments, yes, let me put it there. Context or environment, they may be contrastive or phonemic. So we now move on to the concept of sounds in contrastive distribution. So when we say sounds are in contrastive distribution, what do we mean by that? We are saying we simply refer to the situation where when we substitute one sound for the other in a word, we change the meaning of the word. When that happens, we say those two sounds we substitute are in contrastive distribution. If you remember, not too long ago, Mr. Apodo gave an example and explained what this is. When we change the meaning, the two sounds, we change the meaning of the word. So we have given you an example. So when I make a request and I say I need a pan, but I end up say I need a ban, I have communicated something differently from what I intended to. First, I need a pan with a consonant P, meaning I need an utensil, cooking utensil. But if I end up and I say I need a ban, I hope you all know what a ban is. With a consonant B, I will communicate something differently in my request. Now, what do we mean? So, moving on, it therefore means the sounds P and B in the examples I've given are in contrastive distribution. So, all phonemes of each and every language are in contrastive distribution. And what it means is if we change any for the other or with the other, the meaning of a word can change. So we say they are all in contrastive distribution. Mr. Podo wants to add to this.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Dumako. The fact that we are replacing one phoneme with another in order to cause a change in meaning, it means that within the phonological system of that language, those two sounds that we are calling phonemes also are described as being in overlapping distribution. It means one can take the place of the other and then result in a change in meaning. So sometimes contrastive distribution is in terms of the fact that when you replace one with the other, they cause meaning change. Overlapping distribution is in the fact that the environment in which one occurs, the other one can also occur there. For example, if we consider the pan versus the ban examples, then where P occurs in that language, B can also occur in that same environment. So they are in overlapping distribution as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Podo, for the further explanations. Now we move on to another phenomenon or term we call complementary distribution of sounds. What do we mean by saying sounds are in complementary distribution? And here it simply means those sounds are not in contrastive distribution. They are allophonic or they are allophones. However, where one occurs, the other does not occur. That is in contrast to the overlapping distribution of sounds. So we have some examples here, and later Mr. Apodo will also add to the examples. So for example, in our earlier examples we gave about allophones and phones, we talked about aspirated sounds, the glottalized sounds, and the plain sounds. So the aspirated sounds in English, in the examples we gave, occurs only in stressed syllables, whereas the glottalized sound occurs in that glottalized sound doesn't occur in any other position. Cannot occur in initial positions, but non-initial position. And by non-initial position, we mean it can occur in a medial position or in a final position, as we saw in the example. But the plain t can occur elsewhere or any other or every place. It can occur at the initial position, in the middle of the word, or in the final place. So that is what we mean by sounds in complementary distribution. Yes. So before we move on, again, Mr. Podo also add to this.
Yeah, maybe we'll try to and also understand it this way, that when we say sounds are in complementary distribution, we are looking at a phoneme. Mr. Adumaku told us earlier that allophones are the varieties of a particular phoneme. So when we take any particular phoneme which is in contrastive distribution with other phonemes, all the environments in which that phoneme can occur, theoretically, there are times that when that phoneme is going to one environment, it assumes one form, and then when it's going into another environment, it assumes another form, and when it's occurring in a different environment, it assumes yet another form. These physical variations of that same phoneme are all playing the roles that the phoneme must play in the phonological system of the language. So the individual allophones are actually complementing one another to cover all the areas, the environments in which the phoneme is supposed to occur. So they are in complementary distribution in such a way that where one of them is assigned to, that is the only place that one can occur. Then the other one has also taken another place. If there are 10 allophones of a particular phoneme, each of those allophones, none of them will occur in the environment of the other, but together they complement one another to cover all the environments that that particular phoneme is supposed to cover. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Apodo. I think he's made it clearer. So that is what we mean by sounds in complementary position distribution. So all of them, the different variants of a phoneme, have their specific places or environment they can exclusively occur. Now all together they complement where the phoneme can occur. So thank you very much, Mr. Podo. Now we move on to a last but one concept we are going to discuss, and that is what we call minimal pair. Once we are talking about sounds that are contrastive and sounds that are not contrastive, maybe we need also to talk about minimal pair to facilitate our understanding. So when we say sounds are in minimal pair, what does it mean? Minimal pair simply refers to a pair of words that differs in only one phonological unit that occurs in the same place and can distinguish meaning. When there is a pair of sounds, a pair of words, that sounds in a pair of words that only differ in one phonological unit, which occurs in the same place, and the difference can bring about a change in meaning, we say those words are in minimal pairs. So for example, let's look at these three examples here. The word lap ending in p versus the word lap ending in b. Similarly, the word pan versus ban. The word shin versus sin. So in each pair, the words are the same, they differ in only one sound, and that sound occurs at the same place. So for instance, let's take the first example, lap versus lab. They are the same, they differ in the last consonant. Whereas the first one is voiceless plosive, the last one in the first example is voiced plosive. Now in the second example, the difference occurs in the initial sound, the initial consonant, p and p. Whereas the first one is voiceless again, the second one is voiced. And the last example, the difference again is in the initial consonant. One is sh, fricative, and the other one affricate. The first one is a fricative, palatal fricative, and then the second one is alveolar fricative. Let's note it's not only consonants that can bring about minimal pairing. Mr. Podo earlier gave an example of pat versus pot. The vowels in the two words make the two words minimal pairs because they are the only sounds that can bring about the change in meaning. And don't forget, the two are also occurring at the same place, that is initial part of the word, in pot versus pat. Here the change occurs in the first one, the final consonant. Both occur in the final consonant. So for instance, in the first example, lap versus lab, if you contrast lap and pile, the two cannot form a minimal pair. Why? Because pile begins with p, a, and ends in l. So the difference will not be in the same place. Again, the second example, pan versus nab, will also not be minimal pairs because the arrangement of the sounds are not the same for us to contrast one phoneme occurring in the same place. So that is for minimal pairs. Now we move on to talk about minimal set, the concept minimal set. Just like minimal pairs, minimal set is a set of words that differ only in one phonological unit, again that occurs in the same place and can bring about a change in the meaning of the words. So we are going to give you examples of some words that are in minimal set. In the examples, we focused on only the initial consonant, and again the difference can also occur in the vowels that occur in the middle or in the consonant that end the words. So for instance, we have the words in the slide: sight, white, light, kite, might, and night. These words form minimal set. Why? Because they are the same, their difference is in the initial consonant of the words. S, r, l, k, and are the words that cause difference in the meaning of these 6 words you see in the slides. And don't forget, crucially, all these different consonants occur at the same place. And what is the place? The place is the initial position of the words. At this point, I will let Mr. Podo. Oh, okay. So this, we are saying these words are all in minimal pairs simply because they change only in the initial position of the words. That is the initial consonant of the words. Now, before we finally end today's class, let's note that in determining which sounds are in either minimal pairs or minimal set, one needs to consider the phonetic or the pronunciation forms and not the written or orthographic forms, because we are dealing with sounds, not letters of the alphabet. That is why in the examples we transcribe them so that you know we are talking about sounds and not words. So if I ask you whether these two words I'm going to spell, you tell me whether they are in minimal pairs or not. The words are night. First one is N-I-G-H-T versus another word K-N-I-G-H-T. Are they in minimal pair or not? Answer that. We will discuss it later on. Any addition? Mr. Podo at this time will add to what we have done so far.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Dumako. I would like to add that minimal pair is one of the tests that we conduct on the sounds in any particular language in order to establish their phonemic status. What I mean is, we have sounds in every language. It is very important for us to know whether all those sounds are phonemes, and for that matter contrastive or not. We must find out which of the sounds are contrastive, and for that matter they are phonemes, and which of them are not phonemes. So to be able to tell whether a sound is a phoneme or not, one of the tests, there are various tests that you can use, but the commonest of the tests we use is the minimal pair test or minimal set test. It therefore means that if we take a and k and t in tree, for example, and you add a to k, and you have ka, for example, and then you add a to t, and you have ta, and you have meanings for these two words. They are minimal pairs in tree. And then if ka means something different from ta in tree, then you are now establishing the fact that t and k, which are the differences between the two words, are phonemes of the language. So you use minimal pair test to establish the phonemic status of each and every sound you have. If you replace one sound with another and it doesn't change meaning, then you are now going into what Mr. Dumako called an allophone. Then I always ask, why do they call it minimal pairs? Pairs, we understand that is because they are moving in twos. Then why are they calling them minimal pairs? It's because the words that they are selecting are short words. Sometimes they are two sound words. Remember, I'm not saying two letter words. Two sound words and three sounds word, and probably the longest may be four sound. The longer the word, the difficult it is for you to get a pair for it, which will have only one sound making the difference, and that sound happens to be at the same position where the other one is. So the longer the word, the difficult it is for you to get a pair for it. But if you have short sound words, like two sound words and three sounds words, it is easier for you to get pairs for them. That is why they call them minimal pairs. Thank you very much, Mr. Dumako.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Podo, for the further elaborations. So we are coming to the end of today's lesson. But finally, let's note that for some languages, they don't contrast between s and sh. So the examples we gave in English, sight, the example same and shame. Some languages, always wherever they find s, will pronounce it sh. So in such languages, the two occurring might not contrast at all. So the word same and shame, the speakers might not see the difference between those two words. So in that case, those two words might not constitute a minimal pair in that particular language. So as Mr. Podo rightly said, minimal pairs are also language specific. There's language that says for us, t, sometimes even aspirated sound, t, t, and then t, might be a minimal pair in a language. But as we've just seen in English, it's never a minimal pair. So this is where we want to end. Today we've been able to talk about contrastive and non-contrastive units, where we said contrastive units are those sounds or segments which, when changed in a word, can bring about a change in meaning of that particular word. But the non-contrastive units are those sounds which, when changed, do not bring about a change in meaning of a particular word. And usually, non-contrastive units are allophones, or physical realizations of a contrastive unit. And so we moved on also to talk about several terminologies, what we call free variation. And we said free variations are sounds, even though they are phoneme, but when we change them in a word, they will not bring about a change in meaning. And that one too is not cross-linguistic. It's very few languages that have such phenomenon in them. And we've talked about what minimal pair is and what minimal set is. So I hope you've enjoyed today's class, and we keep advocating and advising you to stay safe. We are already in week 9. Soon we'll be cruising to the end of the course. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any further questions or comments, social handles, WhatsApp and Telegram are all available for you to comment. Thank you, and see you again, God willing, next week. Bye for now.